expansion was discussed both at a committee level and at the board, and ultimately the league office was tasked by our board with doing an in-depth.
Welcome back to the Clark Update, WNBA fans, because something major is being discussed surrounding Caitlin Clark, Adam Silver, and the future direction of the league. With the latest developments involving Clark and the New York Liberty putting even more attention on the relationship between the WNBA and the NBA's leadership. According to the narrative surrounding this situation, Silver has now addressed the broader issue and made his position clear, raising a much bigger question about what exactly is changing behind the scenes and why this decision has generated so much attention across the basketball world. Professional basketball appears to be entering a new phase, and much of the conversation revolves around one name that has dominated headlines for months: Caitlin Clark. While fans and analysts have been focused on statistics, shooting percentages, ratings, and individual performances, the league's business strategy has increasingly become part of the conversation as well, particularly as Clark's enormous popularity continues to reshape expectations around women's basketball. For years, the WNBA operated with a slower growth mentality and a more cautious approach to expansion, travel, media exposure, and league-wide investment. But the rapid rise in attention surrounding Clark has helped accelerate conversations about what the league could become. From a business perspective, the numbers surrounding her popularity are difficult to ignore, and that has created a situation where every major decision involving the league is examined through a much larger financial and strategic lens. If you appreciate this kind of WNBA breakdown, make sure to support the channel by liking the video and subscribing, because more than 73% of viewers reportedly still haven't subscribed, and it only takes a second to join the community. Now, back to the story, because the larger issue is that the game's business structure and priorities appear to be evolving, and not everyone is necessarily comfortable with the new direction. For longtime veterans and people who helped build the league over decades, any sudden shift in priorities can feel like a rejection of the traditional WNBA model. But from a business standpoint, the argument is straightforward. Caitlin Clark has become much more than a passing basketball story. Her popularity has created enormous commercial potential, and that has forced league executives to think differently about how the product is marketed, protected, promoted, and distributed. The debate becomes even more complicated when conversations turn toward the physical treatment Clark has received during her professional career, because from the moment she entered the league, her games have often included intense defensive attention, hard contact, and controversial moments that generated enormous discussion. What some people viewed as normal competitive basketball was interpreted by others as excessive treatment of a highly marketable young star, and that put the league in a difficult position. If officials become more aggressive about protecting star players, critics can argue that the rules are being changed for one individual. If officials simply allow everything to continue, the league risks losing one of its biggest attractions to injury. That tension sits at the center of the broader conversation about Clark and the WNBA's future. The financial argument is also impossible to ignore because Clark's games have attracted extraordinary levels of attention, making the league increasingly aware of how valuable her availability is to the overall product. The concern is not simply about protecting one player, it is about protecting the long-term commercial momentum surrounding an entire league. If a major attraction is sidelined for an extended period, the impact can stretch beyond one box score and into television ratings, ticket sales, merchandise, sponsorships, and national media coverage. That helps explain why the league's approach to player safety, officiating, scheduling, and presentation has become such a major part of the conversation. At the same time, the discussion surrounding Clark's Olympic situation added another layer to the debate, with fans and analysts questioning the reasoning behind her absence from the United States Olympic roster and speculating about whether fatigue management, player development, or broader league considerations played a role. It is important, however, to distinguish confirmed facts from speculation, because decisions involving national teams and player selection involve many factors, and not every theory circulating online represents an established league strategy. What is clear is that Clark's presence or absence from major basketball events now generates significantly more attention than it would have just a few years ago. That reality has also intersected with the WNBA's massive new media rights landscape, which has changed the financial stakes surrounding the league. As the value of WNBA broadcasting and distribution continues to rise, the league is no longer being treated simply as a niche sports property. It is increasingly being positioned as an important part of the broader professional basketball ecosystem. The involvement of major media companies has created opportunities for increased national exposure, stronger production quality, expanded coverage, and potentially greater earning power for players. But it also means every major storyline receives greater scrutiny. Every controversial call, every social media dispute, every locker room disagreement, and every major player storyline can now become part of a much larger national conversation. That increased visibility can be a blessing, but it also raises the pressure on everyone involved because the league is operating under a much brighter spotlight than before. One of the clearest examples of this changing era is the conversation around charter travel. WNBA players dealt with commercial travel limitations for years, including long security lines, crowded flights, delays, and the logistical challenges that come with constantly moving between cities. But the league eventually began moving toward expanded charter flight access, a development that represented a major investment in player comfort, health, safety, and overall professionalism. The growth of the league and the increased attention surrounding its biggest stars made the old travel model increasingly difficult to defend, and the transition toward more private travel became symbolic of a broader shift in how the WNBA views itself. It was no longer simply about surviving with limited resources. It was about building an organization capable of operating like a major professional sports league. That investment also comes with challenges, particularly for smaller market franchises that must absorb significantly higher operating costs, but the underlying message is clear. If the WNBA wants to present itself as a major global sports brand, it has to invest accordingly. The next major question is expansion, and this may be one of the most consequential decisions of all. The league has ambitious plans to add franchises and reach new markets, with cities such as Portland, Toronto, and the Bay Area entering the conversation, and expansion creates both enormous opportunities and legitimate concerns. More teams mean more markets, more jobs, more games, more merchandise, more television inventory, and potentially an even larger fan base. But rapid expansion also raises questions about talent distribution and competitive balance. Existing players could face new pressures as rosters change and expansion drafts reshape team structures, while executives must determine whether the league can grow quickly without weakening the overall quality of play. The urgency behind that expansion is closely connected to the current moment because the WNBA has an opportunity to capitalize on an unprecedented surge of attention around players like Clark. More teams create more opportunities to sell tickets, jerseys, sponsorships, media rights, and local partnerships, and the league has every incentive to build on that momentum while interest is at its highest. The larger story, however, is that Caitlin Clark has become a symbol of a much broader transformation. Her popularity has accelerated conversations that were already developing around women's basketball, but it has also exposed how much potential remains within the league. The question is no longer whether the WNBA can attract attention. It is whether the league can convert that attention into sustained growth, stronger infrastructure, better player conditions, expanded media coverage, and a long-term business model capable of supporting the next generation of stars. Whether Adam Silver personally controls every one of these developments is a separate question, because the WNBA has its own leadership structure and decision-making processes. But there is no denying that the NBA and WNBA are increasingly connected from a business and strategic perspective. And with Caitlin Clark serving as one of the most visible figures in the entire women's basketball ecosystem, every major move involving the league is going to be analyzed through the lens of her influence. That is why this moment matters so much. The league is growing. The money is increasing, the media attention is expanding, the travel infrastructure is improving, and expansion is moving forward. But the real test will be whether all of those changes can produce a healthier, stronger, more competitive WNBA for years to come. Clark may have accelerated the conversation, but the future of the league will ultimately depend on what the organization does with the opportunity in front of it. The biggest question is no longer whether women's basketball has a market, because the audience has already. There is growing concern about what the next collective bargaining agreement could actually look like, especially as current players find themselves in a league where the business side appears to be evolving faster than the players' union can respond. At the same time, the way the league has handled the increasingly popular rivalry and jealousy narratives surrounding Caitlin Clark and other prominent players has raised even more questions about the WNBA's changing internal culture. For years, the league emphasized unity, sisterhood, and collective growth, but the modern sports business understands something very clearly: drama sells. That has represented a major departure from the WNBA's traditional marketing approach, particularly as the league has increasingly embraced the competitive narratives surrounding Clark and other young stars, such as Angel Reese. Instead of trying to minimize every rivalry or controversial storyline, the league has increasingly benefited from allowing those conversations to generate attention, social media engagement, ticket demand, and broader public interest. But that strategy comes with consequences, because the more the WNBA adopts an NBA-style entertainment model, the more some players may feel as though they are being turned into characters in a larger story, with certain athletes positioned as heroes and others unintentionally cast as villains. From the league's perspective, however, the results are difficult to ignore, because the increased attention has created a level of engagement that women's basketball had rarely experienced before. The broader point is that the WNBA is no longer operating like a small developmental sports property that can afford to move slowly and cautiously. It is increasingly being treated as a major professional entertainment business with enormous growth potential, and that shift has fundamentally changed the stakes for everyone involved. The decisions being made around Caitlin Clark have become symbolic of that transformation, because every major choice involving her represents a larger question about what the league wants to become. Whether fans love this new direction or miss the more close-knit culture of previous years, the reality is that the business environment has changed, and there may be no going back to the old model. The potential benefits are enormous, but so are the growing pains, particularly as the next generation of players enters a league that is becoming more visible, more valuable, and more commercially aggressive. The conflict between younger stars and established veterans is unlikely to disappear anytime soon, especially as the financial stakes continue to rise and every decision receives greater public scrutiny. Nowhere is that tension more obvious than in the debate over officiating and physical defense. Some players and fans have questioned whether the league is becoming more protective of Clark, while others argue that the WNBA simply has to modernize its approach to allow its most dynamic offensive players to operate in a faster, more entertaining environment. The controversy becomes particularly intense when defensive players who built their reputations on physicality suddenly feel as though the standards are changing around them. Imagine spending years developing a defensive identity based on toughness and physical pressure, only to enter a new era where officials are instructed to emphasize freedom of movement and offensive flow more aggressively. Coaches would have to reconsider strategies that had worked for years, and defenders would have to adapt to a game where certain forms of contact are more likely to draw whistles. That adjustment can feel brutal, especially for veterans who believe they are simply playing the style of basketball they were taught. But from the league's perspective, the goal is to create a product built around pace, scoring, spacing, transition opportunities, and highlight plays that can travel quickly across social media. Clark naturally fits into that environment because her ability to shoot from deep, create plays, and generate spectacular moments gives the league exactly the kind of content that attracts casual viewers. The important point, however, is that these changes should not automatically be described as proof that the league is secretly rigging games for one player. Officiating philosophy can evolve for many reasons, including player safety, freedom of movement, entertainment value, competitive balance, and changes in the way modern basketball is played. Still, The perception of preferential treatment can create its own problems, particularly when defenders feel they are being judged differently depending on who is standing on the other side of the matchup. That psychological pressure can be significant because a hard foul on a highly visible player may not simply produce a whistle. It can produce days of media coverage, social media criticism, and public debate about the defender involved. In that environment, players may begin wondering whether they should continue playing aggressively or change their approach entirely, and that can alter the game even without a formal rule change. The broader business strategy is obvious. The league wants its biggest stars healthy, visible, and capable of producing the moments that drive conversation, because every spectacular performance can generate another wave of attention. But there is a trade-off, and the price can be a growing sense of alienation among players who believe the physical, defensive identity that helped define the league is being pushed aside in favor of entertainment. Some longtime fans may view that as a betrayal of the WNBA's original character, while newer audiences may simply see it as the natural evolution of professional basketball. And that difference in perspective is becoming one of the defining tensions of this new era. The people who have followed the league for years may value toughness, defensive intensity, and the idea that every basket must be earned, while newer viewers may be more interested in fast transitions, deep three-pointers, star rivalries, and the spectacle surrounding the biggest names. Neither audience is necessarily wrong, but the league now has to figure out how to satisfy both without losing its identity. The financial implications are enormous, because if the WNBA successfully converts its current surge in popularity into sustained revenue growth, players could eventually benefit through significantly higher salaries, stronger benefits, better facilities, improved travel, and increased opportunities. The uncomfortable part is that the transition period may be hardest for the veterans who are being asked to adapt before they see the full financial rewards of that growth. In 5 years, the players who are frustrated today could potentially benefit from a much larger salary structure, but right now they are living through the disruption rather than the payoff. That is why the next collective bargaining agreement could become so important. It will help determine how the league's increasing revenue is distributed, how player protections evolve, how working conditions are handled, and how much influence players have over the direction of the league. The relationship between the front office and the players is also changing. The WNBA historically operated with a more collaborative, close-knit atmosphere, but rapid commercialization naturally introduces a more corporate mindset. Executives may feel that the league cannot afford to waste a limited window of opportunity, while players may feel that growth should not come at the expense of their voices, traditions, or professional autonomy. That tension is not unique to basketball. It is a familiar conflict whenever a sports league suddenly experiences explosive commercial growth. What makes this particular moment so fascinating is the speed at which everything is happening. A league that once fought for attention is now trying to manage an overwhelming amount of it, and Caitlin Clark has become one of the central figures in that transformation. She is no longer simply a player whose statistics are discussed after games. She has become a major commercial and cultural force whose every move is examined through the lens of the league itself. That puts enormous pressure on Clark as well, because every decision involving her is analyzed for possible bias, while her own performances are judged against expectations that most athletes never experience. Yet the broader sports business reality is difficult to escape. Professional sports are businesses as well as competitions, and the WNBA is increasingly being managed with the financial seriousness associated with a major global sports property. The outcome could ultimately be transformative. The game is becoming faster, the stakes are increasing, the audience is expanding, and international interest is growing, but the questions become even more important as the league moves forward. When the next major young star enters the WNBA, will the league promote and protect that player in the same way, or will Caitlin Clark remain a unique case because of the extraordinary circumstances surrounding her rise? Will the league find a sustainable balance between protecting its stars and respecting the physical identity of the sport? Will veterans and younger players find common ground, or will the generational divide become even more pronounced? Those questions remain unanswered, but one thing is already clear. The WNBA is no longer simply trying to catch up with the rest of professional sports. It is attempting to establish its own pace and define its own future. The initial shock of this transformation may eventually fade, but the decisions being made today could become the standard that future generations inherit. The league has taken the necessary steps to survive and capitalize on an unprecedented opportunity, but in doing so, it has permanently changed the environment in which its players compete. Whether that